Our learning goal today is to take a look at how humans utilize our natural resources to maintain our society. We're going to do this by taking some notes on sustainability and humans and resource use. Today's notes are going to utilize Cornell-style note system. Basically, you're going to complete the notes paper by filling in the blanks, and you're going to write some questions and a summary at the end. Today's Cornell notes looks like this. We've got the main section here where we fill in the notes. You're going to basically just fill in the blanks as I go through the PowerPoint. Over here in the margin, this is where you're going to write your questions. We'll talk about that in a second. And then down here, you got your summary at the end. After we get done filling in the main part of the notes with the blanks, it's important that you go back and review the notes periodically. Also within the Cornell note system, it's important that we interact with the notes. Now, what does this mean? This means that you get a highlighter, you highlight important things, you underline, you circle, and we really want to identify things that you think are important or things that you may not understand that you might have questions about. The next thing we do is write at least 3 questions in the left-hand margin of the paper. Now, these could be questions you have about things you don't understand, something you might want to ask about later, or they could be quiz-style questions. For example, it's something you think you might see on a test. And the whole point of having this margin here that we write our questions in is that you write down your question next to the topic that it's related to. For example, if you had a question about natural income, you would write it down right here, and then you have your answer over here, or the thing that you had your question about would be right next to it. So the last thing we do at the end of the notes is we write a summary. Now, the summary should be a well-constructed paragraph. It should be written in complete sentences, and it should take up most of or all of the lines that are at the bottom of the page. So before we get into sustainability, which is living within the means of nature, we have to define some key terms. First word we've got here, natural capital, also known as natural resources. I'm sure you've heard that before. A natural resource is a resource that exists in the world without any action from humans. Natural capital is the source or stocks of resources and services that are derived from nature. In other words, the stuff we use to build our societies, where does that come from? It comes from natural capital. You want to build a house, you're going to need some wood. The wood comes from trees, which come from a forest. The forest would be your natural capital. The wood would be what we call natural income. Natural capital and natural resources can be divided into either renewable or non-renewable categories. Some more examples. We already talked about the forest. We've got a kelp bed here, home to a wide range of sea life. We've got mineral deposits, fisheries, fertile soil. Food comes from here. We want to make sure that we can define natural capital and give some examples. Like we said, we can divide natural capital or natural resources into renewable and non-renewable sources. So a renewable source would be a resource that can be used repeatedly and replaced naturally. Some examples are living species of organisms on the earth, or entire ecosystems can be considered renewable natural resources. A good way to think of these resources is that they're self-producing and self-maintaining. They're used in a way that doesn't deplete them. Non-renewable natural resources are resources that cannot be replenished. For example, fossil fuels, metals, once you use it, you lose it, and it's gone forever. This picture is down there on your notes, and it illustrates the link between natural capital and the economy. You can see we've got goods and services coming from natural capital that's utilized by the economy, and depending on how the natural capital is utilized, this can have positive and negative impacts on that natural capital itself. If we use that natural capital irresponsibly, if we extract too much from it, this can cause environmental damage. In turn, we degrade the natural capital. Natural capital produces natural incomes. Now, what this is the annual yield of goods and services provided by the environment. Or you can think of it as how much of our natural resources we take. For example, over here we've got a picture of wood. We've got some grain down here. We know that wood comes from a forest. The grain would come from the soil or agriculture, which are both examples of natural capital. Some examples here, we can actually measure how much wood is produced from a forest and how much grain is produced from a certain amount of soil or land. We want to make sure that we can define natural income and provide some examples. That natural income can be used for economic production. which is the process of converting the natural world into a manufactured world. For example, over here we have some paper. This could be made from the wood pulp. Down here we've got some Cheerios. These could be made from the grain. To summarize, we could say that natural capital provides natural income, the annual yield of goods and services. So how much natural resources we remove from the environment every year. We've got some examples down here of goods and services. If we think about the value of natural capital, remember that many things in nature don't have an extrinsic value. They only have intrinsic value. We've got some examples here. The beauty of Glacier National Park, photosynthesis, prevention of mudslides by healthy grass. These aren't worth anything economically. These are all things that we need, but remember, in our society, we tend to overvalue extrinsic aspects of the environment. Remember, we should be able to discuss the idea that nature can have both intrinsic and extrinsic value. So how do we extrinsically value natural capital? Economic value is determined by the market price of goods and services. How much is someone willing to pay for it? This changes over time. The market for something fluctuates. The amount of the natural income will also fluctuate over time. How much is produced varies slightly from year to year. Factors that can influence a resource's status over time include cultural, economic, and technological factors. A good example here is the element uranium. It was discovered in the late 1700s, but nobody really cared about it until the mid-1900s when it began to be utilized for numerous nuclear technologies. We should be able to suggest a reason that the value of natural capital can change over time and try to think of your own specific example. This leads us into sustainability. One reason that the value of natural capital can change over time is simply that Earth's resources are limited. We have a finite amount of matter. As we use something up, we end up with less of it and it becomes more valuable. The definition that we'll use for sustainability is the use and management of resources that allows full natural replacement. So as we use up that natural income, it doesn't dip into the natural capital and degrade it. In other words, using resources at a rate that will prevent them from running out over time. So this can be a difficult balance. We know that humans have to use resources, but how can we figure out to use just the right amount so that we don't deplete the resources that we have? The answer is we have to strive to live sustainably. It takes time for Earth's resources to be replenished, and if we really want to live sustainably, we can only use resources at a rate that will prevent their depletion. And I want you to think about this. A corporation's goal is to maximize profits, to make as much money as possible. Why would this be a bad idea to maximize the amount of natural income that we take from the environment every year? A good measurement of whether or not we're living sustainably is something that we call overshoot day. Now, this is the day in a particular year when we have used up all the natural income produced in that year, and we have begun to dip into the natural capital. And if we look at the trend for this over time, we see that in the past, it's been later than it is now. For example, in 2008, the overshoot day was on August 13th. So that means that on that day, we've used up all the natural equity that the Earth has produced in that year, and we started to dip into our reserves. 10 years later, we saw that it was August 1st, and in 2019, it was at the end of July, the 29th. So what this means is that after that date, we are using future generations' resources. So I want you to think about this. Are humans currently living sustainably? One way that we can determine whether or not a person or city, state, or a country is living sustainably is by looking at something that we call the ecological footprint. So this is how much land or water a given population requires to produce all the resources they consume and take in all the waste that they produce. So the ecological footprint is calculated by looking at 6 different human activities that all require space. These activities are growing crops, producing grazing animals, harvesting timber from forests, catching fish, producing the infrastructure that we use as we go throughout our lives, things such as housing, transportation, and absorbing the CO2, the carbon dioxide that is emitted. Or another way to look at it is how fast we consume resources and generate waste compared to how fast nature can absorb our waste and generate new resources. So one metric that the ecological footprint can produce is it'll tell you how many planet Earths it would take if everybody in the world lived the same lifestyle as you. So right now, the current estimate for the population of the world is that it will take 1.6 planet Earths to provide the natural resources and ecological services that we currently use. So I want you to think about how many Earths do you think it would take to sustain everyone if we all lived like you did? To wrap up your notes, you're going to head over to footprintcalculator.org and fill out the questionnaire to find out your own personal ecological footprint. Make sure you fill that in the blank at the end of your notes. Then you're going to remember to write down your 3 questions in the left side margin and fill in your summary down there at the bottom of the back page.